town of Crestwood had always been the kind of place where nothing ever truly happened. Nestled between the misty pine forests and a sluggish river, its streets were lined with weather-beaten clapboard houses, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly cut grass, even in late October, when the chill began to cling to your bones like a silent guest. It was here, in this quiet pocket of the world, that Clara Dawson spent her days in a rhythm so steady it could lull a hurricane to sleep. Clara was 23, a part-time barista at Brew and Bites, the only cafe in town with Wi-Fi strong enough to stream videos. Her life was a collage of small, predictable moments. The hiss of the espresso machine at dawn, the way old Mr. Jenkins always ordered his black coffee with 2 sugars he'd never admit to needing, the sound of her boots crunching over gravel as she walked home each evening. Her apartment above the thrift store on Maple Street was cozy in a cobbled-together way. Fairy lights strung over a second-hand couch, textbooks stacked like totems on her desk, a windowsill crowded with succulents she'd named after 90s sitcom characters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. That week, though, the town buzzed with a subdued excitement. The annual Harvest Diddy Party, a tradition as old as Crestwood itself, was just days away. No one quite remembered how it got its name, but every fall, the community center transformed into a kaleidoscope of paper lanterns, hay bales, and cider-scented laughter. Teens dared each other to sneak into the abandoned mill on the outskirts of town, while parents swapped casserole recipes and pretended not to notice. For Clara, it was just another fixture in the calendar, like the first frost, or the way the streetlights flickered at exactly 7:03 p.m. Her roommate, Liam, had been hyping it up for weeks. "Come on, Clara," he'd say, tossing a crumpled flyer onto the kitchen table. His grin was all crooked charm, the kind that made you forgive him for leaving dishes in the sink. "You've skipped the last 2. What's the point of living in a town with one decent party if you don't even go?" She'd roll her eyes, but secretly she didn't hate his persistence. Liam was the closest thing she had to family here, a lanky film student with a habit of quoting Hitchcock at inappropriate times. They'd met 2 years ago, when he'd accidentally locked himself out of his car in the cafe parking lot. Now, he borrowed her sweaters and left half-finished screenplays on the coffee table. On the afternoon of the party, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of clouds that promised rain but never delivered. Clara's shift at the cafe dragged, the usual customers replaced by out-of-towners here for the festivities. She wiped down tables, her mind drifting to the essay she needed to finish. The symbolism of isolation in Gothic literature. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cafe's neon open sign. By nightfall, the community center glowed like a jack-o'-lantern, its windows spilling warm light onto the cracked parking lot. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, tugging her oversized cardigan tighter. The air buzzed with chatter and the tinny thump of a playlist someone had dared to call spooky bangers. Hayrides carted giggling kids past the old oak tree at the center of the square, its branches clawing at the sky. Liam found her leaning against a picnic table, a cup of lukewarm cider in hand. "You made it," he said, nudging her shoulder. His breath fogged in the cold. "Now, was that so hard?" She smirked. "Don't get used to it." For a while it was nice, normal. They wandered past booths selling caramel apples and hand-knit scarves, nodding at faces they half recognized. Mrs. Henderson from the library waved, her silver hair tucked under a crocheted witch hat. A group of teenagers dared each other to touch the rusted bell outside the mill, their laughter sharp and bright. Clara almost forgot the gnawing dread she'd felt earlier, the way the shadows in her apartment hallway had seemed to stretch a little too long that morning, or the faint, sourceless hum she'd heard while watering Phoebe, the succulent named after friends. It wasn't until later, as the crowd thinned and the lanterns began to gutter, that she noticed the man by the bonfire. He stood perfectly still, his back to the flames, face obscured by the brim of a hat that didn't quite match the rest of his outfit. Too formal, too old. Something about the way the firelight avoided him made her pause. Liam was mid-sentence, ranting about a documentary on cursed VHS tapes, when Clara interrupted. "Do you see that guy?" she whispered, nodding toward the fire. Liam squinted. "What guy?" The space where the man had stood was empty, save for a curl of smoke rising from the embers. Above them, the streetlights flickered. Once, twice, and went dark, but only for a moment. When the light returned, the square was unchanged. The music swelled, someone dropped a cup, and Liam laughed, already moving on. Clara stared at the bonfire, its flames licking hungrily at the night. She told herself it was nothing, just the cold or fatigue, or the leftover adrenaline from reading too many ghost stories. By the time they left, the moon hung high and pale, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Clara's apartment welcomed her with the familiar creak of the third stair, the hum of the fridge, the faint scent of lavender from her dryer sheets. She fell asleep to the murmur of the TV downstairs, Liam snoring on the couch after another failed attempt at all-night horror movie marathon. It was all so ordinary. But as the clock ticked past 3 a.m., something shifted. A draft slithered through the crack under her bedroom door, though the window was closed. The succulents on the sill trembled, their leaves brushing against the glass like tiny, anxious hands. And somewhere, far off, a bell rang, a sound that didn't belong to any church in Crestwood. Clara stirred, her eyelids fluttering. In the dark, the room held its breath. The morning after the harvest Diddy Party dawned crisp and uneventful, the kind of October day that made Crestwood feel like a postcard. Sunlight filtered through the pines, casting long, delicate shadows over the dew-soaked grass. Clara woke to the sound of Liam clattering around in the kitchen downstairs, the smell of burnt toast creeping under her door. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, half convinced the tremors of the night before had been a dream, a side effect of too much cider and Liam's insistence on rewatching The Shining until 2 a.m. But then her eyes drifted to the windowsill. The succulents sat undisturbed, their plump leaves catching the pale gold light. Phoebe, however, had tilted slightly to the left, as if straining toward the wall. She frowned. "You're losing it, Dawson," she muttered, swinging her legs out of bed. The floorboards groaned in agreement. Downstairs, Liam was perched on the edge of the couch, a laptop balanced on his knees, and a piece of charcoal-smudged toast dangling from his mouth. His hair stuck up in chaotic tufts, and he wore the same Twin Peaks shirt he'd had on for 3 days. "Morning," he said around the toast, not looking up. "There's coffee. Sort of." The sort of turned out to be a pot of sludge, so thick it could have been used to patch the roof. Clara poured it anyway, leaning against the counter as she scrolled through her phone. A text from her mom. "Did you remember to vote?" And a reminder about her essay deadline. Nothing about mysterious men or haunted bells. Normalcy, she decided tasted like overcooked coffee. Work was its usual rhythm of steam and small talk. Brew and bites hummed with post-party gossip, Mrs. Patel's prize-winning pumpkin pie, the teenagers who'd gotten caught spray painting the old mill, the way the bonfire had inexplicably roared blue for a few seconds. Probably just gas, Mr. Jenkins grumbled, stirring his coffee with more vigor than necessary. Clara nodded absently, her mind snagging on the memory of the man by the fire. Too formal, too old. But when she'd asked Liam about it on their walk home, he'd shrugged. Dunno, maybe a tourist, or one of those historical reenactor guys. Crestwood didn't get tourists. The day settled into a rhythm again, though the air seemed heavier somehow, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. Clara's shifts blurred into a montage of frothing milk and scribbling essay notes on napkins. Liam became obsessed with filming a documentary about the town's quaint eeriness, which mostly involved him lugging a camera to the riverbank and muttering about lighting. On Thursday, it rained, a slow, persistent drizzle that turned the streets to liquid mirrors. By Friday, the clouds had peeled back, revealing a sky so clear it felt like a rebuke. It was on one of these ordinary afternoons, while shelving books at the library, that Clara found the photograph. The Crestwood Public Library was a relic of the 1920s, all mahogany shelves and stained glass windows that threw fractured rainbows onto the carpet. Mrs. Henderson had enlisted Clara's help to organize the local history section, a task that mostly involved dusting off leather-bound ledgers and avoiding the basement, which smelled of mildew and regret. The photo was tucked inside a crumbling copy of New England Folklore and Myth, its edges curled like autumn leaves. Black and white, faded to sepia, it showed a group of townsfolk standing in front of the community center. They wore clothes from another century. High collars, long skirts, faces stern and unsmiling. But what caught her eye was the figure at the far left, barely in frame. A man in a hat, his features blurred, one hand raised as if waving or beckoning. Find something interesting, dear. Mrs. Henderson materialized beside her, her witch hat from the party replaced by a cardigan draped over her shoulders like a shawl. Clara hesitated. Just old photos. Do you know who this is? She pointed to the blurred man. The librarian adjusted her glasses, peering at the image. Hard to say. Lots of folks passed through Crestwood back then. Lumber workers mostly. Though, she trailed off, her finger hovering over the community center's doors. That symbol there, on the archway. See it? They painted over it in the 50s. Some kind of old superstition, I think. Clara squinted. Carved into the wood above the doors was a faint emblem, a circle with intersecting lines, like a compass rose wrapped in thorns. What does it mean? Oh, nothing, probably. Mrs. Henderson chuckled, sliding the book back onto the shelf. People loved their cryptic doodles back then. Now, how about some tea? I've got chamomile. The moment dissolved, but the symbol lingered in Clara's mind. That night she sketched it in the margin of her Gothic-lit essay, the lines jagged and uneven. When Liam barged in to complain about his documentary's lack of existential dread, she barely noticed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ordinary began to fray. There were the noises, a faint tapping at her window after midnight, rhythmic and patient, though she'd found nothing but wind-rattled branches. The way her reflection in the cafe's bathroom mirror sometimes seemed to lag half a second behind. And the dreams. Vivid, suffocating things where she wandered the pine forests, the ground soft and wet beneath her feet, a bell tolling in the distance. She'd wake gasping, her sheets tangled, Liam's snores a steady anchor in the dark. But it was the little things that unnerved her most. The way her keys would slide just out of reach on the countertop, the radio in Brew and Bites crackling with static even on cloudless days. Once, while closing up, she'd seen a shadow dart across the parking lot, too tall, too angular to be a deer. When she'd blinked, it was gone. "You look like hell," Liam announced one evening, sprawled on the floor, with his camera dismantled into a dozen pieces. "Seriously, when's the last time you slept?" She shrugged, staring at her laptop. The essay glared back, half-finished. The symbolism of isolation. "Dunno, I keep having weird dreams. About forests, bells, that guy from the bonfire." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Liam paused, a screwdriver hovering over a lens. "You're still hung up on that? Forget it. No, wait." He sat up, suddenly serious. "You really saw someone?" "I don't know. Maybe." She chewed her lip. "It's probably nothing. Just stress." But Liam wasn't listening. He'd already grabbed his phone, typing furiously. "Okay, hear me out. What if it's connected? The bonfire guy, the symbol in your book, the general creepiness of this town. There's gotta be lore, ghost stories, curses. Or it's a sleep-deprived barista hallucinating. Same difference." He flopped back onto the rug, grinning. "Come on, Clara. When life hands you a mystery, you don't just make lemonade. You throw a lemon at it and see what happens." She rolled her eyes. But later, as she lay in bed, his words looped in her head. What if? Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines. Somewhere, far beyond her window, the abandoned mill stood silent, its boarded-up windows like closed eyes. The next morning, she took a different route to work. The mill loomed at the end of Mill Road, a hulking skeleton of brick and rusted metal. Weeds clawed through the parking lot, and the air smelled of damp rot. Clara hadn't been here since high school, when she dared to touch its walls on a dare. The bricks cold even in summer, as if the place had its own weather. Now, in the thin morning light, it looked smaller, sad, almost. She was about to turn back when a glint caught her eye. Nestled in the weeds near the entrance was a shard of glass, green and curved like the part of a bottle. Beside it, half buried in mud, lay a hat. Not just any hat. Wide-brimmed, black, the felt worn, but unmistakably old-fashioned. The kind of thing you'd see in a history book, not tangled in Crestwood's weeds. Clara's breath itched. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the damp fabric. "Hey, you kids better not be messing around in there." She jerked back. Old Mr. Brody, the town's part-time groundskeeper, was hobbling toward her, his face red beneath a faded baseball cap. "That place is condemned. You trying to get yourself killed?" "I wasn't. I just... Go on, get." He waved a gnarled hand, coughing. "Damn vandals." She fled, her heart pounding, but not before glancing back. The hat was gone. Only the glass remained, winking in the weak sun. By the time she reached Brew and Bites, her hands had stopped shaking. The cafe was empty, the chairs still upside down on tables. She flipped the sign to open, her routine steadying her. Grind the beans, warm the pastries, wipe the counter. Normal, safe. But when she opened the cash register, a slip of paper fluttered out. A receipt dated October 31st, 1924. The ink was faded, the handwriting spidery and thin. 1 black coffee, 2 sugars. Clara froze. The bell above the door jingled. Mr. Jenkins shuffled in, grumbling about the cold. She crumpled the receipt, shoved it in her apron, and plastered on a smile. The usual. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. As the espresso machine hissed, Clara glanced out the window. The street was quiet, leaves skittering across the pavement. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure standing beneath the oak tree, tall, still, face hidden by a brim. Then a truck rumbled past, and the sidewalk was empty. The coffee steamed in its cup. 2 sugars, unspoken. Normal. Safe. The following days in Crestwood passed with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over a town like a thick blanket, muffling secrets beneath its weave. Clara's shifts at Brew and Bites grew quieter as October waned, the post-harvest lull leaving the cafe mostly empty except for the regulars. Mr. Jenkins, with his 2 silent sugars, became a fixture at the corner table, his newspaper rustling like dried leaves. Clara began to notice small patterns, the way he always folded the obituaries first, or how his fingers lingered on articles about local history, as if searching for something he couldn't name. Liam, meanwhile, had plunged headfirst into his documentary. His camera now followed him everywhere, a 3rd limb perpetually slung over his shoulder. He'd taken to interviewing townsfolk under the guise of capturing Crestwood's charm, though his questions often veered toward the macabre. "Did you know this town had 3 unsolved disappearances in the 80s? He announced one evening, barging into the apartment with a stack of photocopied police reports. All around Halloween. Coincidence, probably. But still, spooky, right?" Clara hummed noncommittally, her eyes fixed on the symbols she'd sketched in her notebook. The compass rose wrapped in thorns. She'd started seeing it everywhere, etched into the base of the oak tree in the square, scratched onto the underside of the diner's counter, even woven into the ironwork of the bridge that spanned the river. It was as if the town had tattooed itself with a mark, half hidden but indelible. One afternoon, while shelving returns at the library, she stumbled upon a box of unmarked microfilm reels. Mrs. Henderson had long since retired to the back room with her tea, leaving Clara alone in the musty silence. The first reel contained issues of the Crestwood Chronicle from the 1920s. Grainy headlines spoke of lumber mill accidents, barn raisings, and a particularly harsh winter. But halfway through the roll, a headline made her pause. Local landmark. Vandalized, mysterious symbols found at community center. The article, dated October 30th, 1924, mentioned a group of concerned citizens painting over carvings on the building's facade. A circle with intersecting lines, described as pagan nonsense. The date prickled at her memory. October 31st, 1924, the receipt in her apron. She hurried to the next reel, her fingers trembling as she threaded the film into the viewer. The following day's edition was sparse, as if hastily printed. A single column noted the cancellation of that year's Harvest Diddy Party due to unforeseen circumstances. No details, no follow-up. "Find anything good?" Clara jumped. Liam leaned against the microfilm cabinet, clutching a paper bag of greasy diner fries. "You're supposed to be filming existential dread," she said, shutting off the viewer. I got hungry. Also, he tossed a fry into his mouth. Mrs. Patel told me the community center was built on an old burial ground. Well, burial ground is a stretch, more like a potter's field for loggers who died in accidents. But still, burial ground adjacent. Clara's stomach tightened. When? The 1800s, I think. She said there's a plaque somewhere, but the town covered it up in the 50s. Something about bad vibes. He squinted at her notes. What's with the doodle? Nothing. She snapped the notebook shut. just something from a book. He raised an eyebrow but didn't press. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in Clara's bedroom window. She dreamt of the forest again, the pine needles soft underfoot, the bell tolling in the distance, closer this time. When she woke, her throat raw from cold, she found her desk chair pulled neatly to the window, facing the mill. "You moved it in your sleep," she told herself, "or Liam's messing with you." But the chair left no scuff marks on the floor. The next morning, Clara took the long way to work, cutting through the cemetery on Hillcrest Road. The oldest graves dated back to the 1700s, their headstones worn smooth as sea glass. Near the back fence, she found it, a small, weathered plaque half buried in ivy. "In memory of those who toiled and fell, 1821, 1894. No names, just numbers. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on something, a flat, mossy stone nearly swallowed by the earth. Kneeling, she brushed away the debris. Carved into the surface was the symbol, its lines filled with lichen. "They used to call it the Weaver's Wheel," a voice said. Clara spun. Mrs. Henderson stood a few feet away, clutching a bouquet of wilted dahlias. Her expression was unreadable. "The symbol," the librarian continued, nodding at the stone. "Back when the mill was running, the loggers believed it warded off bad luck, carved it into tools, door frames, even graves, apparently." She knelt beside Clara, her knees popping. Superstition, of course. But people cling to strange things when they're afraid. Afraid of what? Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the tree line. The woods, mostly. Back then, they weren't just trees. They were alive. In the old stories, at least. She stood abruptly, dusting off her skirt. "Best not to dwell on it, dear. The past has a way of muddying the present." Clara watched her go, the dahlias trembling in her wake. By the time Halloween arrived, the town had leaned into its autumnal charm. Porches bristled with cornstalks and plastic skeletons, and the air buzzed with the static of excitement. Bruin Bites had become a hub for pumpkin spice cravings, and overheard gossip about the weird vibes at this year's Diddy Party. The bonfire kept dying, a woman complained to her friend as Clara refilled their mugs, like 5 times, and the cider tasted off, metallic almost. Clara's hand slipped, splashing coffee onto the saucer. Liam, true to form, had decided their Halloween would involve a low-key investigation of the mill. "We'll go at sunset," he insisted, fiddling with his camera's night vision setting. "Document the ambiance, maybe find more clues about Hat Guy. We're not calling him that. Too late. It's canon." They set out as the sky deepened to bruised purple, the first stars pricking through the haze. The mill loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. Clara's flashlight cut a shaky path through the weeds, illuminating beer cans and cigarette butts. Evidence of countless dares. "This place is way less scary in the dark," Liam lied, his voice tight. The door hung ajar, swollen with damp. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and iron. Liam's camera light swept over crumbling walls, shattered glass, and whoa! A section of the floor had collapsed, revealing a cellar strewn with debris. Clara's beam caught the glint of something metal, a rusted chain coiled like a snake. Beside it, a wooden crate splintered with age. "Jackpot," Liam whispered. The crate held remnants of a life interrupted, a moth-eaten flannel shirt, a tin lunch pail crusted with dirt, and a leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to ghosts, but one entry stood out, dated October 29th, 1924. "They say the Weaver's angry, the symbol's failing. Men are hearing bells in the woods, seeing shapes in the fire. Tomorrow, we seal the archway. Hope it's enough." Clara's breath fogged in the cold. The community center archway. The symbol, a sound cut her off. A low, resonant dong, like a bell struck once, miles away. The flashlight flickered. "Did you hear that?" Liam whispered. Before she could answer, a voice floated through the darkness, thin and reedy. "Clara." It came from everywhere. Nowhere. Liam grabbed her arm, his camera clattering to the floor. "We need to go. Now." They ran, the beam of the flashlight jerking wildly, shadows lunging at their heels. Clara didn't look back. Couldn't. The cold clung to her skin long after they'd reached the streetlights. Their glow suddenly fragile, insufficient. Back at the apartment, they sat in silence, the journal between them on the coffee table. Liam's hands still shook as he scrolled through the camera's footage. Static, glitches, a blur of motion too fast to parse. "What now?" he asked finally. Clara stared at the symbol drawn in her notebook, its lines now inked over and over, dark as a scar. "We find out what they sealed, and why it's not staying sealed." Outside, the wind stirred the pines, their branches scraping against the roof. Somewhere beneath the town, beneath the layers of time and silence, something answered. But for now, the night held its breath. The days after their flight from the mills settled into a fragile normalcy, though the air in Crestwood seemed to hum with a tension Clara couldn't name. The journal from the cellar now lived on their coffee table, its pages carefully flattened under a stack of Liam's film theory textbooks. They pored over it in stolen moments, deciphering fragments of entries that spoke of the Weaver's toll and the thinning veil. The more they read, the more the symbol, the Weaver's wheel, seemed to bleed into the edges of their lives. Clara found it scrawled in condensation on the cafe's bathroom mirror one morning, gone by the time she blinked. Liam discovered it etched into the frost on his car windshield, melting away with the sunrise. The townsfolk, too, seemed altered in subtle ways. Mrs. Patel's laughter at the farmer's market sounded a note too high, her eyes darting toward the tree line as she bagged Clara's apples. Old Mr. Brody took to patrolling the mill's perimeter at odd hours, a rusty shovel slung over his shoulder, muttering about kids these days. Even the weather turned capricious, sudden cold snaps icing the cafe's windows, followed by unnatural warmth that made the pines sweat resin onto the sidewalks. Clara's dreams grew teeth. She'd wake with pine needles in her hair, her sheets gritty with soil, though her window had been locked. One night she stumbled into the kitchen to find her hands caked with dirt, a single green shard of glass clutched in her palm, the same color as the bottle fragment near the mill. Liam found her scrubbing her skin raw at the sink, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "It's just stress," he said, but his reflection in the window behind her wouldn't meet her eyes. The documentary became Liam's obsession. He spliced together footage of the mill, the cemetery plaque, and shaky interviews with elderly residents who spoke in riddles. "Things used to walk here that ain't got names," said Old Man Marlowe, his gnarled fingers tapping the weaver's wheel carved into his porch rail. "But we don't talk about that, see? Might stir 'em up again." When Liam played the clip back, the audio warped. A low, resonant bell, tolling beneath the man's words, though no church bell rang in Crestwood that day. At Brew and Bites, the past refused to stay buried. The antique cash register, usually reliable, began spitting out receipts dated 1924 with increasing frequency. Clara kept them folded in her apron pocket, the paper growing damp with the sweat. Regulars started ordering drinks they'd never asked for before. Black coffee with 2 sugars, bitter teas, mugs of cider gone cold before they reached the table. Mr. Jenkins stopped folding his newspaper altogether, his bloodshot eyes tracking Clara as she moved behind the counter. "He came in last night," Liam murmured one evening, pausing his camera's playback. The screen showed a time-lapse of the community center's archway, the symbol faint but visible under a layer of peeling paint. "That guy. I saw him in the alley when I was taking out the trash. Just standing there, facing the wall." Clara's throat tightened. "Did he turn around?" "Nah, but when I looked away for a second, he was gone." Liam's laugh was brittle. "Probably just some dude, right? Maybe he's got a thing for dumpsters." They both knew better. On Halloween morning, Clara found the community center doors ajar, though the annual party wasn't until dusk. The air inside smelled of burnt sugar and wet ash. Her flashlight beam trembled as it swept over the walls. And there, beneath decades of paint, the original symbol pulsed. The weaver's wheel, carved deep into the wood, its lines glowing faintly in the dim light. As she reached out, a draft slithered through the room, carrying the sound of rustling pages. The journal, still miles away on her coffee table, its entries whispering in her mind. The veil thins. The wheel must hold. She ran, her boots echoing through empty streets. By afternoon, the town had donned its Halloween skin. Paper bats taped to storefronts, pumpkins grinning from porches. But beneath the chatter of costumed children, a current of unease thrummed. Parents herded their kids home early, citing the cold. Shopkeepers locked doors before sunset. At the cafe, Clara served caramel macchiatos with trembling hands, the steam curling into shapes that almost resembled faces. Liam arrived at closing time, his camera bag slung across his chest like armor. "We need to check the archives again. There's something we're missing." The library was dark, Mrs. Henderson long gone. They worked in silence, their flashlight beams crisscrossing the local history section. It was Liam who found it, a pamphlet tucked behind a genealogy volume, its cover emblazoned with the Weaver's Wheel. Crestwood Lumber Co., Safety Protocols and Superstitions, 1892. "Listen to this," he whispered, voice fraying. "In the event of unexplained phenomena, e.g., bell sounds, shadow figures, tool malfunctions, workers shall reinforce the Weaver's Wheel at all entry points. Failure to maintain the seal may result in breach." Clara's finger traced the faded diagram. The community center archway, the mill's main entrance, the church steeple, all marked with the symbol, all anchors. "They're failing," she said. "The ones at the mill are gone. The community center's is buried under paint. If they're all like that..." A floorboard creaked above them. They froze. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the second-floor reading room. Liam's camera light swung upward, catching the dust motes swirling in agitated spirals. "Mrs. Henderson," Clara called, her voice thin. The footsteps paused. Then, a laugh, high and hollow, like wind through a cracked bell. They didn't stay to hear it twice. The night swallowed them whole, the streetlights flickering as they ran. By unspoken agreement, they headed for the one place that still felt safe, the apartment above the thrift store. But as they rounded the corner onto Maple Street, Clara skidded to a halt. There on their doorstep sat a hat, wide-brimmed, black, damp with dew. Liam made a choked sound. "That's new." Clara's keys jangled as she fumbled with the lock. Inside, the air was thick, stale. The journal lay open on the table, pages splayed like wings. An entry they'd never seen before stared up at them, ink fresh as blood. It's too late for seals. The weaver walks. Find the heart, or join the chorus. Outside, the first trick-or-treaters began to roam, their laughter sharp and bright against the gathering dark. Somewhere beneath it all, a bell began to toll. The bell's toll shuddered through Crestwood, deeper now, as if the sound were being dragged up from the earth itself. Clara's fingers trembled as she stared at the journal's fresh entry. The words, "Find the heart, or join the chorus," bleeding into the paper's yellowed grain. Outside, the laughter of trick-or-treaters twisted into something shrill and frayed, their costumes flickering at the edges of her vision. Too many shadows where none should be. Liam slammed the apartment window shut, but the cold seeped in anyway, frosting the glass. "We can't stay here." They ran, the journal clutched to Clara's chest, their breath pluming in the air. The streets seemed to warp as they moved, storefronts stretching and compressing like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Porch lights winked out as they passed, plunging the sidewalks into pockets of black. Ahead, the community center blazed with false cheer, its paper lanterns swaying in a wind that didn't touch the trees. Inside, the Harvest Diddy Party pulsed with a manic energy. Parents huddled near the cider table, their smiles too wide, while children darted through legs with animal shrieks. The bonfire roared blue at its core, casting long, trembling shadows that didn't match the bodies around it. Clara's gaze snagged on the archway above the stage. The symbol, once hidden beneath layers of paint, now glowed faintly, its lines throbbing like a vein. "The heart's here," she said, more instinct than certainty. "It has to be." They slipped through the crowd, shoulders brushing arms that felt too solid, too cold. Behind the stage, a door marked storage creaked open before Liam could touch the handle. Stairs spiraled down, the air smelling of wet stone and iron. The basement was a cathedral of roots and rot. Roots from the oak above had split the walls, snaking across a dirt floor littered with bones. Animal, maybe. Though Clara spotted a sun-bleached ribcage too large for a deer. At the room's center stood a stone well, its mouth choked with brambles. The weaver's wheel was carved into its rim, the grooves filled with something dark and glistening. "Oil?" Liam whispered, swiping a finger. He recoiled. "No. Smells like resin. Pine." Clara's pulse roared in her ears. The journal had mentioned a heart of the grove, an anchor point between worlds. She stepped closer, her flashlight beam shaking. The well's depths hummed, a sound that vibrated in her teeth. "Clara." The voice was everywhere. Nowhere. Liam's camera light swept at the walls as the shadows began to peel themselves from the stone. Figures, tall and spindle-limbed, their faces smudges of ash. They moved with a lurching grace, circling the well, their fingertips brushing the symbol. "Reinforce the seal," Clara breathed, fumbling in her pocket for the green glass shard she'd kept. The one from the mill. The journal had spoken of old tokens. Maybe. She pressed the glass into the symbol's central groove. The resin bubbled, hissing, and for a moment, the shadows stilled. Then the ground lurched. The bonfire's blue flame surged down the stairs, flooding the basement. It didn't burn, not yet, but coiled around their ankles like a serpent. Above them, the party's music warped, violins screeching into a sound like bones breaking. "You delay the inevitable." The hat guy stood at the foot of the stairs, his face still hidden. But his voice, God, his voice, was a chorus of whispers, layered over the bell's toll. Behind him, the townsfolk shuffled into view, their eyes milky and unblinking. Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Patel, even old man Marlowe, his mouth sewn shut with coarse twine. Liam grabbed Clara's arm, yanking her toward a gap in the roots. "There's another way out. Move." They crawled through the dirt, the roots tightening around their wrists, their ankles. The well's hum rose to a scream as the shadows converged, their forms solidifying, antlers of twisted bone, eyes like cracked glass. Clara's lungs burned, the glass shard digging into her palm as she clawed forward. Ahead, a sliver of moonlight, a root cellar door, half buried. Liam kicked it open, and they spilled into the cemetery, the freshly turned soil of the potter's field, soft beneath them. The community center loomed behind, its windows now black voids. But the woods were moving. Pines bent like bows, their branches snapping as something colossal stirred within. The earth buckled, unearthing grave markers Clara had never seen, crude stones etched with the weaver's wheel, and beneath the tolling bell, a new sound, the creak of ropes, the groan of a massive weight swinging free. Liam's camera, miraculously still strapped to him, captured it all in jagged fragments, the shadows flowing like rivers toward the woods, the hat guy standing at the tree line, arm raised in invitation. The heart is not a place, Clara realized, the journal's words clawing at her mind. It's a threshold. The ground split. A hand, skeletal and wreathed in roots, erupted from the soil, followed by a crown of antlers fused with iron nails. The weaver's face was a hollowed log, sap oozing like tears, its mouth a splintered gash. It didn't speak. It pulled, and the world tilted. Clara's legs gave out. Liam dragged her back, but the earth crumbled beneath them, the cemetery sliding into the well's hungry throat. She gripped his jacket, the glass shard slicing her palm, blood mingling with resin. "Clara," Liam's voice, raw and human. She slammed the shard into the weaver's wrist. The scream that followed wasn't sound. It was pressure, a vacuum collapsing. The creature recoiled, its form unraveling into smoke and splinters. The townsfolk collapsed like cut strings, the hat guy's silhouette dissolving into mist. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the bell tolled again, distant but unrelenting. The well's hum softened to a whisper, the symbol dimming. Not dead, sleeping. Liam helped her stand, his hands shaking as the first real snow began to fall. The woods still watched, the veil still thinned, but they'd bought time. Somewhere, the heart waited. The woods swallowed them whole. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, erasing the path behind Clara and Liam as they stumbled deeper into the pines. Their breaths came in ragged clouds, the cold gnawing through their jackets like teeth. Behind them, the cemetery's iron gates groaned, then slammed shut with a finality that echoed in their bones. "This way," Clara hissed, though she had no idea where this way led. The journal, now tucked inside her shirt, pulsed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Liam trailed behind, his camera a useless weight, its lens frosted over. The trees pressed closer. Branches, brittle with ice, reached for them with jagged fingers. Clara's boots sank into the snow, each step a battle. She could feel the woods, watching, not just the weaver, but the pines themselves, their gnarled trunks twisting to track their movement. A low rhythmic creaking began, like ropes straining under weight. Liam grabbed her arm. "Do you hear that?" The gallows, she thought, remembering the journal's account of loggers hanged for sacrilege against the grove. but she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Keep moving. The forest floor sloped downward, the snow giving way to black, loamy soil that reeked of decay. They emerged into a clearing where the trees formed a perfect ring, their branches interlocked overhead like a ribcage. At the center stood a stone altar, moss devouring its edges, the weaver's wheel carved deep into its surface. Around it, 9 stumps formed a crude circle, each topped with a melted candle, wax frozen in mid-drip. Clara's breath hitched. This is where they did it. The rituals. Yeah, and I'm real eager to not repeat history, Liam muttered. But he was already circling the altar, brushing snow from its surface. His gloves came away smeared with resin. Look, beneath the grime, names were etched into the stone. Loggers from the 1800s, their dates of death all the same. October 31st. Clara traced the letters, her fingertip catching on a fresh groove. A new name, still glistening with sap. Clara Dawson. The bell tolled, closer now. A twig snapped. They turned as one. The townsfolk emerged from the trees, their movements jerky, puppet-like. Mr. Jenkins led the pack, his newspaper clutched in a fist, ink bleeding down his wrists. Mrs. Padel's hands were full of rotting pumpkins, their rinds squelching as she advanced. Their eyes were voids, mouths slack, but their heads tilted in unison toward the altar. You're late, they intoned, voices blending into the weaver's chorus. Liam backed into Clara, his elbow knocking the journal from her grip. It fell open to a page they'd never seen. A sketch of the altar, a knife gripped in a skeletal hand. The heart demands payment. The caption read, Payment? Liam's voice cracked. The townsfolk lurched forward. Clara scrambled for the journal, her mittens slipping on the pages. It's a trade, a life for the seal. No, there's another way. The weaver's laugh cut through the clearing, branches shuddering. Above them, the gallows creaked into view, nooses swaying empty. The hat guy stood beneath them, his form flickering between the solid and shadow. This time, his face was visible, a shifting mosaic of every townsfolk's features, eyes burning with pinpricks of blue flame. You broke the rules, the weaver whispered through his mouth. Now you'll join the chorus. The townsfolk surged. Clara ducked as Mrs. Padel hurled a pumpkin, its rancid guts splattering the altar. Liam tackled Mr. Jenkins, the old man's strength inhuman, his fingers clawing at Liam's throat. The knife, Clara screamed. Liam rolled, grabbing a rusted blade from the altar. He swung blindly, the steel biting into Mr. Jenkins' arm. No blood flowed, only sap, thick and golden. The townsfolk recoiled, hissing. A sliver of time. Clara lunged for the journal, her eyes scanning the ritual instructions. The heart lies where the roots drink deepest. She stared at the altar, then the stumps, the candles, the well. It's connected. The resin, the roots. It's all one system. She grabbed Liam's sleeve, dragging him toward the largest stump. Help me. They hacked at the wood, the knife dull but relentless. The townsfolk howled, swarming, but froze as the first chip of stump flew free. A root, thick as a femur, pulsed beneath the wood. It writhed, dripping resin, and for a moment, the entire forest seemed to scream. Now, Clara plunged the knife into the root. The backlash was immediate. The earth bucked, throwing them to the ground. Trees splintered, roots erupting like spears. The weaver's form materialized above the altar, antlers scraping the sky, its body a tangle of roots and rotting cloth. You dare! Clara stabbed again, deeper. The resin gushed, scalding her hands, but she held on. Liam wrapped his arms around her waist, anchoring her as the wind tore at their clothes. The weaver's scream split the air. The townsfolk collapsed, their strings cut. The hat guy's form unraveled, his hat spinning into the snow. But the root wasn't dying. It was healing. The resin knit the wound shut, pushing the knife out with a sickening slurp. The weaver's laugh returned, weaker but venomous. You cannot kill what is already dead. The gallows creaked, a noose lowered, hovering at Clara's eye level. Liam grabbed her hand. Run. Now. They crashed through the underbrush, the forest alive with malice. Roots tripped them, branches lashed their faces. Behind, the weaver's breath rattled, each exhalation frosting the air with ice. Ahead, a light flickered, Bruin Bites, its neon sign sputtering. They burst through the door, slamming it shut as the weaver's shadow slammed against the glass. Inside, the cafe was a time capsule. The antique register rang on its own, receipts from 1924 spilling onto the floor. The succulents on the windowsill had grown wild, vines coating the walls, their leaves etched with the weaver's wheel. Liam barricaded the door with chairs. What now? It'll break through. Clara's gaze landed on the espresso machine. The journal's words echoed. Fire cleanses. She grabbed a bottle of cooking sherry, dousing the counter. Get back. The weaver's shadow seeped under the door, tendrils of root and resin. Clara struck a match. The explosion of flame was blinding. The shadow recoiled, screeching, as blue fire raced along the vines. The cafe's windows shattered, cold air fanning the blaze. They stumbled into the alley, the weaver's wail shaking the street. The fire spread, devouring the thrift store, the bookstore, the library. Every building marked with a hidden symbol. Crestwood burned, but the flames burned blue, cold, and hungry. The bell tolled, frantic now. From the ashes, the weaver rose, smaller, fractured, but alive. Its antlers were charred stumps, its voice a wet rasp. You cannot escape. Clara and Liam ran, not toward the woods, but the river. The one place the journal had warned against, where the water runs silent. The bridge was icy, the river below black and still. The weaver's footsteps thudded behind them. Jump, Clara said. Are you insane? The heart, it's not in the forest. It's here. The river's at the threshold. The weaver reached the bridge, its shadow swallowing the moon. They jumped. The water didn't feel like water. It felt like hands, cold, skeletal, dragging them down. Clara's lungs burned as the current pulled them under the mill, into the flooded cellar where it had all begun. The journal floated past, pages disintegrating. A single phrase survived. The heart beats below. Above, the weaver's silhouette loomed on the bridge, waiting. But here, in the dark, something else waited too. The water held them like a clenched fist, cold and unyielding. Clara's lungs screamed as the current dragged her deeper. The mill's submerged cellar swallowing what little light seeped through the cracks above. Liam's hand slipped from hers, the bubbles from his choked gasp, silver in the gloom. She kicked toward a sliver of movement, a root snaking through the water, its tip glowing faintly with the same resin that had pulsed in the forest. The heart, it wasn't a metaphor. Embedded in the cellar wall, half buried in silt, and the bones of those who tried to seal it before, was a massive throbbing knot of roots. Resin oozed from its cracks, swirling in the water like ink. The weaver's wheel glowed at its center, etched into a stone older than Crestwood itself. Liam's flashlight flickered to life nearby, the beam catching the panic in his eyes. He pointed to the journal, now a waterlogged husk caught in the roots, its final legible page pressed against the glass of a shattered mason jar. Break the heart, break the cycle. Clara clawed her way to the knot, her fingers finding the green glass shard still wedged in her pocket. The resin surged, hot even underwater, as she drove the shard into the root. The river erupted. They washed up on the riverbank at dawn, coughing up black water and sap. The mill stood silent behind them, its shadow stretching long and thin in the morning light. Crestwood, too, was quiet. No sirens, no shouts, just the creak of swinging shop signs and the distant hum of a coffee grinder. The townsfolk didn't remember. Mrs. Patel served scones with a smile, asking if Clara had enjoyed the Diddy Party. Mr. Jenkins grumbled about teenagers and spray paint, his arm bandaged where Liam had slashed him. The community center archway was freshly painted, the symbol buried under layers of eggshell white. Only the scars remained. Liam's camera footage had corrupted, static bleeding into every frame. Clara's succulents withered within a week, their leaves crumbling to dust. And at night, when the wind died, she could still hear it, the faintest echo of a bell, tolling in the marrow of her bones. They never spoke of it, not when they packed their bags, or when Liam sold his camera to pay for a one-way bus ticket out of town, or when Clara found the hat in her suitcase, damp and reeking of river mud. Some truths were too brittle to hold up to the light. The bus pulled away from Crestwood under a sky the color of old bruises. Clara watched the pines shrink in the window, their branches clawing at the clouds. Liam snored beside her, his head lolling against the glass. In her lap, the hat lay folded, unnoticed by the other passengers. She'd tried to leave it, tossed it into a dumpster, buried it in the thrift store donation bin. But it always returned, pristine and patient. As the highway swallowed the last of the town, she finally opened it. Inside, stitched into the lining with thread as black as the resin, was a name. Clara Dawson, 1924. Her breath fogged the window. Outside, the trees blurred into a long, dark smear. Somewhere behind them, a bell tolled. Once, twice, and then the road stretched on, empty,